first, let's set up our page. We need to have oil pastels. It needs to be labeled. So I put oil pastel technique notes. You will need the date, and it's helpful to have your name on there. Let's set up your page for our oil pastel notes. The first thing that we need to do is divide our paper into 7 different areas. It doesn't have to be circles like this one, but it can be if you would like it to be. Then we're going to label each space. 1, color mixing, heavy pressure blending, stippling, oil, scrumbling, light pressure blending, and sgraffito. Let's go over the tools that we will need. We're going to need oil pastels. We'll need paper towel. Later on, we're going to need a stick and oil with Q-tips. I want to first talk about this one right over here. It's heavy pressure. So when we're using an oil pastel and I'm asking you to use heavy pressure, that does not mean that we're pressing so hard that we end up breaking our oil pastels. We want to just make sure that our hand is going back and forth in the same areas as I'm doing right here. And we're also trying to make sure that, that we're not leaving any white spots behind. So heavy pressure just means going back and forth with a heavier hand, but not so heavy that it's breaking an oil pastel. I'm going to use multiple colors here, so I'll choose a different color to go next to this. And you might notice when you're using heavy pressure especially, that there's little tiny flakes that come off, little tiny nuggets of oil pastel. If this is happening to you, I'm going to suggest that you do not wipe it off with your hand. If you do so, what happens is these little pieces will smear all the way across. I also don't want you to just take and dump this over the floor. That's really hard to clean up later on. So if these are bugging you, then go over to the trash and you'll just kind of empty them into a trash. Let's move down to the light pressure. Now, I have created some heavy pressure up here. If there's anything that I need to protect at this point, depending on where heavy pressure was for you, you're going to take your paper towel and lay it over the top so that you don't end up smearing what you've already created. We're going to use light pressure. So most of the time when I'm using light pressure, I'm using the side of my oil pastel rather than the tip. And I'm doing just what it suggests, barely touching the paper with my oil pastel. I can still go back and forth in the same spots, but you're going to notice that there are some white spots left behind. I'm going to fill in this entire spot, this entire area with one color, but then I'm going to come back with this light pressure with a second color. So let's just use some red. So light pressure is really beautiful when you start blending your colors, when you're using one color on top of another. It creates some really wonderful effects. Let's move over to some color mixing. Again, I want to protect this area, so I'm going to put my paper towel over the top so that my hand does not smudge it or smear it. What I have found out is that using colors that are next to each other on the color wheel blend very nicely with each other. So I'm going to do that. Next to yellow, I have green and I have orange. I think I'm going to go with my green color here. So I'm going to take my lighter green and I'm going to use that heavy pressure method next to the yellow and even overlapping it. Again, I'm leaving a lot of oil pastel on my piece of paper as I'm doing this. Now I'm moving to an even darker color. So now I'm using some dark green, but I could move on the color wheel to the next color, which would be blue. That would be fine. That would be a good mix. Notice I'm overlapping these colors as well and adding a lot of oil pastel. Now we're going to use that paper towel, or you can use your finger directly. What we'll do is wrap the paper towel around your finger, and this is going to allow you to bring the oil pastel across each other and start blending it. Notice I started with my lightest colors first, then I'm going to move my way out to my darkest colors. If I start blending at any point here, I'm going to make sure that this whole space has been blended. Even if there's not two colors that I'm mixing together, I want it to be unified in the technique that I'm using. If at any point you're having a hard time with it smudging or smearing, go back and add a little bit more oil pastel, and that should make it smoother when you're mixing your oil pastels. Now let's do some stippling. I'm going to use some new colors for that. Stippling means that you're adding little tiny dots to create your color. So I'm using these dots over and over and over. Now notice I'm not hitting my page, and in fact you can barely hear me using the oil pastel. When you are using oil pastel in a stippling method, you should never be able to hear the oil pastel actually hitting the page. If you're doing that, you're being unkind to the oil pastels, and you need to make sure that your hand is more controlled with your oil pastels. So I'm using two different colors here. It's blending together with my stippling, making those little tiny dots. Scrumbling is when you take your oil pastel and it just kind of meanders across your space. So it looks like it's a little lost. Now notice I'm not going like this. Some students feel that if it's going to look like a scribble, like it kind of is, that we need to be uncontrolled. My hand is very controlled as I'm bringing the oil pastel across my page. I'm thinking about what I'm doing. My hand is under control the entire time. Using multiple colors in a method like this is very helpful. It gives a very interesting and unique look. Moving on to sgraffito. This is one of my favorite methods. I'm going to use a pink first, and what you're going to do is use that heavy pressure again all the way across your entire space. And you can use one single color for this, or you can use multiple colors. I think I'll probably use another warm color underneath here, so I'm doing half of it with the pink. Maybe I'll do some yellow as well, just to see what that's going to turn out like. Now, when you're doing sgraffito, the first layer, which is what we're doing right now, does not have to be oil pastels. You can use crayons or markers for this first layer, but today I'm just exploring oil pastels, so this is going to work out well. Now I'm going to choose a warm or a cool color, and I'm going to go on top of the oil pastel that I've just laid down. And this entire area is going to be filled with a second layer of oil pastel, this time being this cool color, this kind of purpley color. But look at, even when I put it on top of that yellow, see how it turns to a whole completely new shade? So interesting. All right, now this is what we need the stick for. Sgraffito means that you're scratching into the surface. So I'm going to do just that. I'm going to use some hatching and cross hatching, and notice I can see the layers underneath. Now, you can certainly use hatching and cross hatching like I'm doing here, or possibly you create shapes and lines to make designs. So maybe you're using some triangles or polka dots or something rather than the hatching marks that you're seeing here. But what we're doing is pulling off that first layer and revealing the second layer, which is on the paper. And you're going to notice a lot of those little oil pastel nuggets coming off. So take the time, walk over to the garbage. If they're bugging you, walk over to the garbage and dump them directly into the garbage. Don't wipe them across, and don't place them on the floor, please. Thanks. Our last one here is right in the center for me, might not be for you, but it is oil blending. And so what I'm doing here is I'm putting down some more oil pastel in a very heavy pressure again. Most of these techniques use that heavy pressure to begin with. And I'm placing down two colors, doing some blending already by placing it on top of each other. And I want a generous amount of oil pastel. We're going to use a Q-tip. Look at this side has already been used. I'm not worried about that. It's still going to work. And then some oil. Now this is baby oil or mineral oil. Both are going to work just fine for this method. And we're going to take and mix with the oil. And what this does is it kind of breaks down the oil pastel and it turns it into almost a paint. It's so easy to blend your colors in this way. But I will say, if I take this pink right now and put it right over here, it's going to go right into that section. So I started from my lightest section first and brought it across to my darkest sections. This now we'll just need some dry time, so I'll allow that to dry. The oil will disappear and these wonderful marks that you've created will remain.